From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director. And today we're going to be talking with Jessica Donati about the role of U.S. Special Forces in Afghanistan. She has a new book out called Eagle Down, The Last Special Forces Fighting the Forever War. Jessica covers foreign affairs for the Wall Street Journal in Washington, D.C., and has reported from over a dozen countries in the role. She joined the paper as the bureau chief in Kabul in 2015 and lived in Afghanistan for over 4 years. Previously, she worked for Reuters in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, covering the conflicts in both Libya and Afghanistan. Jessica, thank you for joining us, and welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
The U.S. is rapidly approaching an inflection point in Afghanistan. It has drawn down its forces in line with a deal the Trump administration signed with the Taliban late last February to just 2,500 currently, from a high of around 100,000 in 2011. The inter-Afghan talks in Doha, which are meant to lead to a political resolution to the conflict, are bogged down, even as violence in the country continues unabated. And the Biden administration faces an upcoming deadline on May 1st under the U.S.-Taliban deal, when the U.S. is meant to have all of its troops out of the country. Your book focuses on an important part of the story of how we got here, starting with the 2015 decision by the Obama administration to remove most conventional U.S. forces from Afghanistan, and highlights the central, if secretive, role played by U.S. Special Operations Forces in the country over the past 5 years. Why is this an important story to tell, especially now?
When I was reporting in Afghanistan, to me, it was really frustrating to not be able to tell an important part of the story, which was what the U.S. military was up to. From 2015 onwards, because the Obama administration claimed to have brought the war to a responsible conclusion and turned the combat mission into a training mission, they no longer allowed journalists to embed, with the excuse that these were special operations and therefore very secretive. We didn't have access to what they were doing. What became apparent over time, that when the city of Kunduz fell in September 2015, just a few months into this new mission, they sent in special forces teams alongside the Afghan commandos to win the city back. And this was really important because it became a sort of template for how the US military operated in Afghanistan. They would send in these special operations troops and to make it look like the Afghan government was in control or able to win these places back. And they didn't sort of explain what they were doing. So it felt like an important story to tell.
Taking a step back a little bit, I think it's fair to say that for most Americans, Afghanistan has largely fallen off the radar. Looking at the period you cover in the book from 2015 to 2020, what would you say the nature of the U.S. military presence in Afghanistan was, and how big a part of that were the special forces?
Since 2015, the special forces have, and I think we should say special operations, because when we talk about special forces, we mean just Green Berets, and they work with a wide number of supporting troops. So I think it's fair to say special operations, and they've had a huge role, because without them, I think we would see chunks of Afghanistan would have fallen under Taliban control by now. We've seen them recover the city of Kunduz twice. They've saved the Helmand a few times and various other provincial capitals. And the role is not publicized. The U.S. military doesn't want to talk about it, and neither does the U.S. administration, because if they did, then it would raise questions about whether the Afghan government will ever be capable of sustaining itself. What you see is a trend where they're perhaps less capable of controlling territory rather than more.
As you make clear in the book, these special operations forces face a wide range of challenges in trying to carry out that mission in Afghanistan. Can you elaborate on that in a little bit more detail?
Sure. I mean, one of the things that we think of when we think of special operations, that they're going to be super resourced and they're going to have all of the information. But the fact is, when you only have a small number of troops in the country to basically cover the entire country, they're operating as firefighters. So they're being sent to this city or this town as an emergency alongside Afghan troops to help them prevent it from falling under Taliban control. So they often go into these places with very little information, which is problematic. And they also, because the US has planned to leave in various operations, for example, they didn't have basic equipment. They lacked things that they needed to support them out in the field, and that caused them to have losses. So, they are under-resourced.
Another key part of the equation on the ground is, of course, the Afghan military itself. You dealt with a variety of different units during your time there, from local village militias to veteran commandos on the Afghan side. What were your impressions of the Afghan forces?
I think it's very easy to be critical of Afghan forces because we often hear of them that that they didn't stay and defend whatever outposts or checkposts they were supposed to defend. But I think it's important to remember that they don't have the option of cycling in and cycling out. Like even U.S. Special Operations, who are on the front lines and under the most strain, Afghan forces have no choice, and they often have quite poor leadership, corrupt leadership. They would steal their food or uniforms. So I think when you see them lacking motivation in the field, it's understandable. A wide number of Afghan police and army sort of frontline troops, they're very underpaid and very mistreated, and they're not perhaps that willing to fight for the corrupt government. But if you look at the Afghan commandos, the ones that have been trained up alongside U.S. Special Operations and that have the most resources and the most training, they are very, very competent. And I've met some very impressive Afghan commanders, and we felt very comfortable going out on patrols with them. I mean, as comfortable as you can be in those areas.
There's been a lot of speculation about potential scenarios for what might happen if U.S. forces do leave Afghanistan. Given what you've seen on the ground and what you were just speaking about, do you think the Afghan military would be in a position to fight the Taliban on its own?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, while a proportion of the Afghan security forces probably would not stay and fight for the Kabul administration, you have 350,000 or so on the payroll, but you do have a fraction of that would be willing to fight, perhaps not necessarily for President Ghani, but for whoever they see as their leader. So you would, I don't know what the number would be, maybe 10, 20,000, but certainly, the Afghan commandos are very well trained and very unlikely to want to just give in to the Taliban. So I think the idea that if the US leaves, the Taliban are going to sweep into Kabul, it's unlikely. I think what you're more likely to see, and this is also what's so worrying to many people, I think, is that you could see a protracted, horrible civil war with a sort of a splintering amongst different sides.
Switching gears a little bit, I wanted to ask you about the reporting that went into this. By its very nature, this must have been a difficult story to report, to tell. It's not easy to get information about these kind of operations, let alone understand the Special Operations Forces community more broadly. How much of a challenge did that present for you, and how did you address that?
I mean, to me, it was a huge challenge because the U.S. Military, they didn't want to embed reporters with special operations troops, and the few embeds that they would give out would be to reporters from D.C. who'd be sort of shipped in for a short time and who didn't have, all the information that those of us that were covering Afghanistan and living there full time had. For me, it was really a step-by-step process where you would get to know sort of one person and then they would introduce you to another. And you would build out confidence that way. And, I had to convince people that I wanted to tell the story impartially, that I didn't have an agenda. And I think that another reason that I was able to gather the information that I did was because there is frustration amongst the ranks of special operations that they are being used in this way, because for some, you're going back to the same places over and over again, and you're losing your buddies there, and you're not getting air support when you're supposed to, when you don't, your truck doesn't have a working gun. All of these things which are fixable are not addressed. And so I think some of them went away feeling like they had just become a political tool for whichever administration to avoid losing face and admitting defeat. So I think that's one other reason that I was able to gain access to them. And I think a lot of people believe that the story should be told.
On that point, to what extent does the secrecy surrounding special operations make it easy, maybe too easy, for the government to come to kind of overly rely on them as a tool in a messy, complicated conflict like this?
I think that, I understand the need to keep some special operations, some aspects of special operations secret. Obviously, it's for the protection of soldiers because the missions need to be kept secret. But when you have special operations becoming these sort of frontline troops in this role of firefighters, then there has to be a little bit more accountability from the government side about what they're doing with them if this is their main fighting effort. Because if you don't account for what they're doing, then you don't really have to account for whether your policies are working or not. And if you have a policy where you want to stay in Afghanistan long enough for the Afghan government to be able to stand on its own, and you are obscuring the fact that the government isn't able to hold on to major population centers without considerable US support, it's problematic. So I think that there should be more of a public discourse about their role, at least in general terms, so that people, are aware of what the reality is. And when they say, the Afghan government recaptured this city or this place, that it's not entirely true.
Shifting gears to the policy discourse in Washington today, President Biden has been a strong proponent of a light footprint, so-called counterterrorism plus approach, relying on special operations and air power. That sounds quite a lot like what you've just described. So I'm kind of wondering, when it comes to Afghanistan, do you think that would be more of the same?
I think so. I mean, I think that's one of the problems, that over time, since the Obama administration claimed to have ended the war and turned it into this training mission, plus counterterrorism, there isn't any discussion of what counterterrorism really is or who the terrorists are. And generally, there's quite a bit of flexibility as to who you can target. And depending on which rules and which administration and what the political tides in Washington are, you may have more flexibility or less. But generally, the idea is that, to do counterterrorism, you need to keep parts of Afghanistan under relative control, which means you can target groups that are friendly to potential Al Qaeda, and therefore you can target the Taliban. So it really kind of masks what is just a continuation of the war as it's always been. And so, it surprises me that there isn't more of a question over, what counterterrorism means and what will these counterterrorism troops actually be doing.
As I mentioned at the top of the program, President Biden faces an upcoming deadline on May 1st, by which time the U.S. needs to either withdraw its forces from Afghanistan as originally planned, pull out of the U.S. Taliban deal altogether, or try to extend the deadline. What are your thoughts on what's likely to happen there?
I mean, I think if we look at some of the hints that the Biden administration has been dropping over the last few weeks, you see the Pentagon saying that they don't see that the Taliban are keeping their side of the deal. You hear that they are reviewing the peace deal. The Afghan study group put out its advice suggesting that they seek an extension of the deadline. I think all of this is sort of suggests that they want to seek an extension and continue and try and prolong at least the peace process. And I think, what President Biden has said in the past is that he favors a sort of long-term counterterrorism approach, which suggests that he might be open to keeping a small presence of US troops in there to sort of keep a lid on things, indefinitely, which is, I don't know, troubling perhaps.
Looking down the line, what do you think it would take for the U.S. to be able to leave Afghanistan responsibly? What would a sort of realistic, achievable U.S. endgame look like?
I mean, I think that is important. I mean, I think there does need to be a responsible exit. Pulling out in May, is likely to cause the peace process to collapse and both sides to try and win. But I think it's difficult to know how it's possible to leave responsibly because the war has gone on so long, because there has so much resentment built up on all sides. And the problem is that if the US stays, the Afghan government feels empowered. And if the US leaves, that empowers the Taliban. The US can sort of stay sort of half in, half out on the battlefield supporting the government. But, at some point they're going to have to leave. And I don't know whether they can stay long enough for a peace settlement to really be reached. I mean, it depends, I guess, how genuinely the two sides are negotiating. There's some debate about that. But again, if the US says they're staying there forever, then perhaps the Kabul side doesn't have much incentive to negotiate away its power with the Taliban. So it's problematic. And the deal that they signed with the Taliban as well doesn't give the US a chance to stay indefinitely because of the conditions.
Taking a step back, given all the reporting and the research that you did for this book, what are your kind of key takeaways in terms of policy for the US from all of this?
I mean, for me, I think the main purpose of the book was to raise awareness about what the US military is actually doing. I mean, I hope that there is more of a discussion about the way that the US uses special operation troops, and that if they are in this sort of firefighting role, that there should be some more access to what they're doing. I think that's the main idea. And also, I wanted to draw attention to the fact that special operations soldiers are also people. People think of them as being these kind of hardened operators that operate on their own, but they have families, and repeated deployments year after year puts a huge strain on the force. And I think that's problematic. And there's many of these people are fighting a war that the rest of their country has no idea about. And so I think that was one of the things I wanted to address.
I'm curious, what has the response to the book been like from the military and the special operations community?
No, I've had a lot of soldiers reach out to me to say thank you for telling the story and for reporting on the missions. It's been quite amazing. And it makes me a little sad that that they should feel some sort of recognition in a book by a journalist and not by their own leadership or perhaps their own country. Because while the country is saying, while there is a thank you for your service and that sort of thing, people don't really know what their service has been or what the purpose of their service is. And so I think some of the soldiers felt that there was the whole picture in the book. And they were grateful for it.
We're running short on time, but before we wrap up, do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that a final thought that I would offer is that, wars don't end just because we aren't watching, and that even though the Afghan war has dragged on for 20 years, people should take an interest in what their country is doing and what their soldiers are being asked to do. And they should seek some kind of accountability from leadership.
We'll have to leave it there, but thank you so much for joining us today, Jessica.
Thanks very much.
Once again, the book is called Eagle Down: The Last Special Forces Fighting the Forever War. And thank you as well to our audience for listening in and to our production team for their work on today's program. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.